back, everyone, and today we're going to finish out Chapter 2 as we examine mergers and acquisitions. Now, what involves mergers and acquisitions? Well, these are strategies that organizations use to try to expand and grow their business. Oftentimes, the thought is that if we can combine our resources, then we'll have more resources to use in which we can grow. Now, that isn't always the case, but the assumption pretty much maintains the model of mergers. And mergers is the situation where two companies come together by mutual agreement. Acquisitions are a little more overt. Here you have organizations that can take over smaller, weaker organizations, and we'll talk about that. Now, the belief in both of those cases is that, again, we can grow as an organization, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have its challenges along the way. So today we're going to take a look at some of those challenges. We're going to take a look at some successful mergers. Also today, too, we're going to take a look at the idea of productivity measurement. How do you know that your organization is productive? How do you know that your organization is efficient and effective? Well, those are two terms that we're going to examine today, and we're going to be able to measure those two terms with qualitative and quantitative analysis. Qualitative means the quality of the work, but also quantitative measurements deal with the amount of work and whether or not you're getting a return on your investment, which is our human capital. Now, it's very important to know whether or not your employees are actually adding value to that organization, because if they're not, you're losing money. In the past, it was believed that productivity was guesswork. If they just put out a certain amount of product or service, then they're valuable. Today, we can quantify that. We can measure it to the dollar as to whether or not they're being productive or not. So from an HR standpoint, that's pivotal, because you're dealing with people, and you need to make sure that your people are producing the most amount of output for the least amount of investment. So today, let's take a look at mergers and acquisitions, and also let's move on as we measure productivity. Well, welcome back, everybody. And this is Thursday, and we'll finish up Chapter 2 today. And today I want us to talk about mergers and acquisitions, and I also want us to discuss some of the formulas that we can use to assess productivity and whether or not we are making a profit with the employees that we have. Now, let's begin with mergers and acquisitions. When companies merge, there's a lot of confusion, or the tendency to have a lot of confusion, and people are wondering, what am I going to do? What's my responsibility? What's going to be my new role, and so forth. So even there's a lot of truth in the difficulties and the confusion that comes with acquisitions and mergers. Now, as you see here in the slide, there are activities that have to take place before you actually engage in the merger or the acquisition. Now, the merger itself is just the bringing together of two companies. And normally what will happen is that two companies will come together so that they can become larger. Some of the more, lucrative and popular mergers that have taken place in business would be Heinz and Kraft Food. That was a $100 billion merger, and they brought leading household food brands like Philadelphia cream cheese, Heinz tomato ketchup, Heinz tomato sauce under one roof, and the revenues just went through the roof. And at the time, the newly merged entity brought in revenues of around $28 billion. So you can see the benefits of combining resources, but that's not to say that mergers are not without problems. Mergers can cause difficulties when you're combining people and cultures and ideologies and so forth. So that can be a problem, but the ways that we can offset some of the difficulties of mergers is to be able, as you see here in the slide, do due diligence. Now, what is due diligence? Due diligence, and we're going to talk about that, is just researching the company that you're going to merge with. But now, what about acquisitions? Acquisitions is a little bit different. Acquisitions involve taking over a company. You might have heard the term hostile takeover. Well, a acquisition is really just another company consuming the other company, and it can be quite traumatic on the company that's being consumed. Banks are notorious for that. They feed off of smaller, weaker banks, and they will take them over. And normally, when that happens, you see an exodus of middle managers and upper management and executives by the consumed company, and then the employees of the consumed company have to adjust to the way that things are for the company that consumed them. So that's more hostile, and it's more overt as far as getting rid of people, and as far as moving in the direction solely that the larger corporation wants. But that's an acquisition. But still in all, you want to research the company, and that's due diligence. And as I said, we'll take a look at that here in just a little bit. During the integration, you want to address key HR processes, and that means you want to be able to integrate the company that you are either merging with or taking over into your company as soon as possible. And that means for HR being able to develop benefits and compensation packages that they will be able to take on, that your company offers and so forth. You need to make sure that information is flowing between the two companies as the merger takes place and afterwards, or as the acquisition takes place and afterwards. You need to recognize the cultural differences, which there are many challenges with that, and we've talked about how a culture influences an organization. So when you merge, one of the cultures have to go. Pretty much it goes without saying, especially in an acquisition. The company being acquired has really no say-so at all. And then you have post-integration, which is optimizing the workforce and then establishing a new culture. You may keep the old culture, or you may, with the combination of the company or companies, you may want to establish a new culture that reflects the new change in direction that you're going towards. But these have different challenges. And as an HR professional, you're going to have to address these. Now let's go back to due diligence. What is it? Well, due diligence is a comprehensive assessment of all aspects of the business being acquired. Now, what does that involve? Well, it means that HR professionals have to address the issues relating to legal compliance. There are a lot of legalities when you are assuming another company or when you are merging with another company. I know Time Warner and Sony had many headaches when it came to legal processes and laws and so forth. Also, if your company and another company are really the only two in that industry, you have the risk and run the risk of creating a monopoly, and that's an unfair trade practice. So you have to be careful with all of the legal issues. Again, you have to know the compensation and benefits programs that you're going to be offering these new integrated employees, and there should be a seamless transition from their old system to the new system. Labor contract obligations, the quality of talent that you are trying to obtain, these are all considerations, and you want to be able to identify those employees who are going to fit the new environment, and for those who won't fit, you need to transition them out. labor contract obligations. Some companies are unionized, and you're going to have to look at the contracts that the labor organization has when it comes to all of that. And then you're going to have to also, if you already have an existing contract with all of the people that in the organization, if they have labor contracts, you're going to have to oblige those. So there are all types of considerations that you have to make when you're giving due diligence. And it's even more complex when mergers and acquisitions involve companies in different countries. So what you see with American workers and American corporations merging, the complexity is compounded. The complexity increases when you have to go and negotiate and navigate the mergers and acquisitions of companies overseas. Now, we talked about the culture, and really you need to define the desired behaviors to the organization that is coming in and deploy role models. It's not just so much telling them, but you need to show them. Provide meaningful incentives. Give them a purpose. Give them a reward or a sense of accomplishment that when they do a model and when they do integrate those roles into their performance, we want to be able to recognize that, and that will help reinforce those new behaviors. And those incentives, they need to be meaningful. They don't need to just be token gestures. We need to be able to give them things that are meaningful and provide clear and consistent messages. That means really just do what you say and say what you do. The consistency, especially in the beginning stages of integration and mergers and acquisitions, are important. And if you don't develop that level of trust from the very beginning, you're going to have difficulties earning their trust or winning their trust later on down the line. So it's best to just be clear and consistent in everything. You don't have to always give them rosy and flowery and sunshine messages, but you do need to be consistent with the messages that you give them. Now, measuring effectiveness of human resources and human capital. One of your jobs as a manager is to be able to measure productivity, to be able to gauge whether or not your human capital, the people, are really being productive. And how do you measure productivity? We looked at that in Chapter 1. We looked at productivity and then the cost of labor and so forth. Well, what it all boils down to really are two primary elements when it comes to the organization in regards to human effort. First of all, you have to have effectiveness. Effectiveness is the ability of a program, project, or task to produce a specific desired effect or result that can be measured. In other words, effectiveness means that you're able to get the job done. Now, as a manager, you're going to be evaluated on whether or not you do the job. If you can't get the job done, then you're not going to be in management very long. But that's only half of the equation. The second half of all of this deals with efficiency. And efficiency means the degree to which operations are carried out in an economical manner. For instance, if you get the job done, that may be all well and good, but if you're costing the company more than the outcome is worth, then you're not very efficient. So as a manager and as a department, this goes with everybody in the organization. You have to both be effective and you have to be efficient. Now, from a management standpoint, an HR management standpoint, the decisions that you make, because you're not rolling up your sleeves doing the work, you're the one who will be making decisions, and your decisions will be judged based on these two criteria. Was the decision effective? Did it get the job done? And was the decision efficient? Did the job get done at the lowest cost possible? So those are two elements that you will have to keep in the forefront of your mind every day in your career: efficiency and effectiveness. Now, we don't just, in HR or in business, we don't just come up with a goal and say, okay, well, we'll know it when it gets here. We need to be able to measure performance. We need to be able to measure productivity. We need to measure how valuable our employees are and what they're actually producing. None of this stuff is guesswork. In management, you have what we call HR metrics and analytics. So let's take a look at what metrics involves. These are specific measures of HR practices. Now, metrics means that you are measuring, normally statistically, how a certain operation is being done, whether or not, if it's a productivity measure, if it's a performance measure, if it's a return on investment measure. All of these things can be quantified. That means they can be measured, and part of your responsibility will be to do that. And then from the metrics, we have HR analytics. Now, analytics, these are evidence-based approaches to making HR decisions on the basis of quantitative, again, measurable tools and models. So when it comes to performance, when it comes to productivity, we don't guess, and we don't just, well, I hope we're doing good. We know whether or not we're doing good. Why? Because we are using statistical data, we are using metrics, we are measuring performance so that we know exactly what we are getting as a result of the output and investment that we're putting in and the output that our employees are giving us. Now, part of evaluating ourselves as an organization, part of our job and part of our responsibility is to be able to take the best practices that we can and incorporate them into the organization. How do we do that? Well, for one thing, we can use what's called benchmarking. Now, benchmarking is the process of comparing an organization's business results to industry standards or best practices. In other words, you're copying what someone else is doing. Now, every year, business industries, organizations, they enter into kind of like a competition. And the result of that competition, they're rewarded for excellence by being given what's called the Malcolm Baldrige Award. Now, Malcolm Baldrige is a title, it's a trophy, it's an accomplishment of excellence in management. And one of the things that you're allowed, if you win this award, this trophy, one of the things you're allowed to do is to let companies come in and see how you do business. So you're kind of bragging. You're kind of rubbing it in the faces of your rivals. Hey, you come in and just see how things are done right. And that's a big, big honor for organizations. Toyota did that. And in the automobile industry, you had Ford, you had General Motors, you had Chrysler. All of these automobile manufacturers were falling behind with Toyota. Toyota was leading the industry in excellence and quality and so forth, and no one could figure out why in the world or how in the world Toyota could do so well. Well, Toyota won the Malcolm Baldrige that year, and they allowed the other companies, executives, to come in and see how they operated, and it was from that analysis or that type of exposure that enabled the executives at these other automobile industries to realize that, Toyota has the same equipment, but they're treating their people differently than we are. They're using their people differently than we are. And that's what allowed other competitors like Ford and GM to be able to rethink the way that they do business. And it was all because they benchmarked what Toyota was doing. Now, benchmarking from a business standpoint. If you do it well, you're rewarded. Benchmarking in school means you're copying what other people are doing, and that's a no-no. You can fail the course and be thrown out of the school for that. So just remember, benchmarking is a business thing that should be applied in the business world and not in your ministry, or not your ministry, but in education and so forth. Now, the balanced scorecard is a framework organizations use to report on a diverse set of performance measures. Now, what is a balanced scorecard? Well, we see an example here in Figure 213. Now, it's essentially a model that helps us to assess where we're at any given time within that organization as a whole. And you look at it from different dimensions. You have internal business processes, which means, does our operation work processes, is our operation objectives, are our strategies effective? Do we conform to the standards of the industry and so forth? And then you have customer relations. Are the customers satisfied? Are they coming back? Are they loyal? And then you have learning and growth activities, which is the employee capability aspect of it, and institutional knowledge. Are you growing your employees? Are they learning? Are you a learning organization? And then you have financial measures. Are you turning a profit? You know, nothing else matters unless you're generating more revenue than your expenses. And then how are you utilizing that capital? Are you being efficient and effective in the way that you utilize it? And all of these dimensions have to align with your vision and your strategy. And we saw that the vision is the long-term goal. Strategy is the specific place where you want to be. It's a result of the vision. And with that strategy, you're going to have the strategic planning that will help you to ultimately obtain that vision, and that's what you want. And the balanced scorecard will let you at any given time assess how effective and how capable you are of reaching that vision based on those dimensions. Now, we have also human capital and what they call here effectiveness measures. Now, here's where we're getting into more of the statistical data, the analytics. And the first one is return on investment. Now, this is a big term, this is a big formula in the stock market. When you are looking at investing in a company, you want to make sure that your return is greater than the investment that you are putting in for that company. So when you're thinking about stocks, return on investment is a big issue, but also how much of your investment in that organization or in those people are reaping a return. So you can use this in a business environment and not necessarily just on Wall Street, but these are calculations of the value of investments in human capital. Now, Wall Street has its return on investment, HR has its formula, its return on investment, but it looks at it from a human resource standpoint. Now, human capital value added is the adjusted operating profitability figure. This is how much value added resources and capital that the person is generating by being there. You also have human capital return on investment, which is HCROI, which is the calculation of the amount of profit derived from investment in labor. And then you have HEVA, which is the human economic value added, and that's the wealth created per employee. How much are they generating for you? Now, human capital effectiveness measures. When you're looking at that, you're looking at the return on investment is equal to C, which is the capital. That's the value of gains from productivity improvements for the time period. And then you have, that's divided by the operating cost for a new or enhanced system for the time period, plus the one-time cost of acquisition and implementation. So what you're doing here is you're taking the productivity for whatever it was for that person or for that system or whatever, and you're dividing it by the operating cost of that person or the enhanced system for that period of time you're measuring, and the one-time cost of acquisition and implementation, which means how much did it cost you to bring that person on and to be able to train and implement their talents and so forth into that organization. And there you see the formula as it's looked at in the statistical term. Now you also have here what's called human capital value added. Now there are quite a few things that can influence a company's bottom line. Now this includes obvious things like the cost of goods sold or the cost of renting a building. What's more important, these aspects can be measured and analyzed in numerous ways. But what about an organization's people? Now the employees, that's what we're talking about now. But don't they impact a company's bottom line as well? So we need to be able to measure their performance. Don't they add value to a business? The answer is both a resounding yes. I mean, the tougher question might be, how do you quantify all of this? How do you know that the employee is adding value to the company? While some might dismiss the ability to quantify something like this, the reality is that there are numerous ways by which an employee's financial impact upon an organization can be measured. Now, one of them is known as Human Capital Value Added, HCVA. Now, let's take a look at that. As we said here, Human Capital Value Added is revenue minus operating expenses, which include compensation plus benefit cost, divided by the full-time head count. Now, what does this mean? Well, let's take a look at it here. Let's say that you generate in a company, your revenue is $1 billion. That's your revenue. Now, your total cost, which is your operating expenses and so forth, let's say is $800 million. Now, let me finish it out here. Now, what about the employee costs? Let's say, for instance, you have $300 million in employee costs. Now, from that, you have also full-time employees, and let's say you have 5,000 full-time employees. So how would you go about all of this? Well, you would have the 1 billion here minus the 800 minus the 300. Oh, excuse me, that's not million. Okay, so you've got $800 million plus $300 million. So you're going to subtract the 1 billion minus the difference here, which is 500 million. And then you're going to have the 500 million divided by the number of employees, and then you're going to have the result, which is $100,000. So these employees are generating about $100,000. That's how much they're adding value to it. So you take your revenue minus your operating expenses. Now you can't take at the initial part the compensation or the pay. You have to subtract that out. So if they're making total cost is the 300 million plus the 800 million, you would need to subtract the 800 million from the 300 million, and that'll give you the difference there, 500 million. So what we're looking at right now is not the salaries and so forth. We're looking at the other benefits because salaries will be counted back in later. And then you have the difference here, the $500 million divided by 5,000 employees, and here you have the $100 million value added for that company. So this is just an idea of how much and how valuable your employees are for that organization. Now, what about the next one here? And this one is called the human capital return on investment. Now, as your textbook says, the HCROI directly shows the amount of profit derived from investments in labor, which represents the leverage the company has on labor cost. The formula for it uses the same adjusted operating profitability figure and are used for HCVA, which is a human capital value added, but it is divided by the human capital cost. So here's the formula. We see here revenue, and then what we have to consider here is the operating expenses minus what we see, compensation plus benefit cost, divided by compensation and benefit cost. Now, what does all that mean? Well, let's take a look here, and let me give you a formula for that. Let's say your business brought in $80,000 in revenue. Now, your operating expenses, let's say, were $30,000. All right? Now, you paid your employees a total of $20,000 in wages, and you had $9,000 in benefit costs for a total of $29,000. That's your total compensation cost. So how would you go about doing this? Well, you would take the $80,000 minus the $30,000 minus the $29,000 and divide it, I'm just going to put it down here, by 29,000, and that's equal to 0.72. So your human capital, ROI, was 72%. That means you had a return of 72 cents for every dollar invested. So that's pretty close to the amount that you are paying out for that person. So, but this is important to know. I mean, if you're getting a 30% return, if you're getting 30 cents on the dollar, then you need to look at these things. So you need to be as close to a dollar as you can get. But this would be the revenue, taking into consideration the operating costs minus compensation and benefits divided by compensation and benefit costs. And that will give you the human capital return on investment. Now let's take a look here at HEVA. Now what is HEVA? Well, HEVA is the human economic value added. And this is the net profit after taxes minus the cost of capital divided by the number of full-time employees you have. Now it shows the wealth created by the employee, each employee, and it shows how much more valuable the organization has become because of its investment in human capital. Now, wealth is the net operating profit of a firm after the cost of capital is deducted. So what you have after the expense, that's the wealth. The cost of capital is the minimum rate of return demanded by shareholders. So the shareholders are going to want money back for their investment, and that's the cost of capital, however much they want. Now, when a company is making more than the cost of capital, it is creating wealth for shareholders. So if they're investing, let's say, $1 billion, and you're generating $2 billion, then you have a net profit course after taxes, but let's say a net profit of $1 billion. So you're turning a profit for the investors. Why is this important? Well, folks, if you can't keep the investors happy, they're not going to stay around. They're going to withdraw their funds, and you won't have a business anymore. And if you remember from the very beginning, I believe I said it. If I didn't say it then, I'll say it now. Your job in management is to maximize stockholder wealth. Now, you're going to probably hear different business philosophies and perspectives about why managers exist and what's their primary goal all about. Well, I can tell you, if the investor is not pleased with you, they're not going to invest money. And if you don't have money, nothing else is going to matter. So you need to be able to know how much your people are providing value and how much value they're providing for that organization. Now, one of the ways that you can evaluate and assess where you're at as far as your HR resources go is to do an audit. Now, an audit is a formal research effort to assess the current state of an organization's HR practices. Now, these are the things that the audit will focus on. First of all, you'll look at staffing and compensation. Are you staffed with the right amount of people, doing the right amount of work, in the right place at the right time, and so forth? And do you have a compensation strategy that you are incorporating that is going to keep them motivated and keep them fairly compensated for what they're doing? So is your compensation package up to par when it comes to motivating and inspiring people to work? And do you have enough people there to do the work? And are they doing the right type of work? Health and safety, you have to make sure that you maintain a productive workplace, and part of that productivity is to make sure that you have health and safety concerns addressed. And then you have legal compliance. Are you maintaining ADEA standards, ADA standards, Civil Rights Act standards, and so forth? And then do you have the processes and record keeping that keeps the organization up to date on everything? And then finally, are your people staying? And are they staying because of the benefits and the HR strategies that you are incorporating? If you have a positive outcome, once you do the audit in all of these areas, then you are effectively performing your job as an HR strategist and strategy planner. So these are some of the elements that you can consider and some of the formulas that you can use as you go into business. And also you can take a look at this from a ministry standpoint. How much are you paying your ministers for the return that they're giving, whether it's people or membership or expanding programs or whatever? You can be creative with these formulas. They're not just accounting formulas. They're formulas that all managers can use to assess the effectiveness and efficiency of their operation. Well, next week we will cover Chapter 3, so until then, have a good weekend. God bless you, and I'll see you then. Well, everyone, as you can see, when a company wants to grow, it has many opportunities and decisions to make that can help enable that growth. Part of that decision-making process is whether or not to merge or to acquire another organization. And you saw here in the slides that it's more than just bringing together two entities. There are all types of complexities, legal, cultural, values, and so forth, that can determine whether or not this initiative will be successful. So maybe now you have a greater appreciation for what organizations, specifically HR, has to deal with when they try to combine resources in order to be able to grow. Also, we looked at productivity. It's not so much giving a person the work hours and telling them you need to do X, Y, and Z. We need to be able to measure whether or not the individual is actually producing value added resources for that organization, which means that they are bringing more to the table than the input that we're giving them, which would be compensation and benefits and so forth. But we also have to make sure that we're being fair and ethical to that employee, that for the labor and for the productivity that they are giving us, that we're being fair and honest and equitable in the way that we compensate them. Well, next week we're going to start in chapter 3. So until then, have a good weekend. God bless you, and I'll see you next week.